you so much. I just like to say I've been in the National Guard now since April. So in full disclosure, on active duty, I was in the United States Navy for 9 years. And then I transitioned to the Navy Reserve. I flew E-2 Hawkeyes initially in the war in Afghanistan. I transitioned, and of course the war in Iraq, and then I transitioned to the F-18 Hornet. I flew Red Air at the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center for 3 years, which is the parent command to Top Gun in the Navy. So I flew Red Air for Top Gun for 3 years. My job was to study how the enemies of America fly those profiles in an effort to get shot down by Top Gun instructors. And I got shot down a lot. I was an E-2 guy flying an F-18, but I had a great experience doing that. I eventually joined the Navy Reserves. I flew counter-drug operations down in Central and South America and ran for Congress. Once I got elected, I got a phone call from an admiral in the Navy and said, well, congratulations on getting sworn in. You are now being moved out of your squadron. We're going to put you in what's called a volunteer training unit. What that means is that you can no longer fly. You can drill, but you can't get paid to drill. And, of course, you can't deploy. And I asked him, well, what am I supposed to do? He said, well, you can do computer-based training, and when you turn 60, maybe you can get some benefit from that. And so at the end, I started looking at my options. Being from Oklahoma, it didn't take hardly any time before the great Guard of Oklahoma reached out to my office. I had the opportunity to meet them, largely because of NGAUS, by the way. Had the opportunity to meet them. Sure. And of course, I explained to them the situation. They said, well, I think in the National Guard we have some other rules. I think you might be able to fly. I think you might be able to drill. And so in April, I had the opportunity to join the Oklahoma Air National Guard, and I'm happy to be there. I'm telling you, I'm learning a new culture, not only going from the Navy to the Air Force, but also going from the reserves to the National Guard. So I am learning. I'm getting to know my squadron, my wing. They're getting to know me. But it has been a real, and I mean this very sincerely, a real pleasure serving with the Oklahoma Air National Guard. So thank you for having me today. I look forward to the questions.
Representative Takai.
Good morning and aloha. All right. I know some of you still remember that from 2013. Well, it's a pleasure of mine to be here today. In fact, I was kind of looking out in the crowd, and I'm pretty surprised to see so many of you here. It's been a while since I've had the opportunity of just cruising and enjoying hospitality night. And I think I took in maybe 10 years worth of hospitality night last night, hence the coffee. Anyway, it's been great. I wanted to talk a little bit about my background and how I got to be where I am today, more so for your benefit, because prior to getting into Congress, I served in the Hawaii State Legislature for 20 years. And during that time, I created, along with some other people across the nation, the National Network of Legislators in the Military. At our high point, we had about 75 members of state legislators serving in either the Guard or Reserve. And I think that's important because as we ran for office last year, we made it a point to note that we've had the lowest number of veterans serving in Congress since World War II. And the reason why I mentioned this today, and I'm going to also mention it during the company grade ODP in the afternoon, is that there are people out there, not you AGRs and full-time Fed techs, but MDAs that may be contemplating a run for office at the local level, the state level, or frankly at the federal level. And I want to encourage you to do that. Up on stage we have a Democrat, I'm a Democrat, and we have 2 Republicans. One of the things that we've known over the years, for me both in the legislature and also in Congress, is that there's no dispute, no argument about the National Guard. It is a bipartisan effort, and we support it both as Democrats and Republicans. So I just want to encourage any one of you who may have just a little inkling of an idea of possibly running for office one day to do it. And you have resources up here, you have a number of resources in Congress, you have a number of resources in your state legislatures. Please take advantage of that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that despite what Mike said earlier, and I appreciate his brief, and despite what the media is portraying, and we do have our difficulties, we do get along. And it's important to note that because, as I mentioned earlier, the National Guard has tremendous bipartisan support. So as we move forward in the next few days, and frankly for the next few years, just knowing that is very important to you. But the reason why I mention that is because I sat for many years where you're sitting today, and I've listened to a number of guest speakers talk about Congress, give the Congressional report, talk about what's going on at the federal level. And one of the things that I felt was missing was the call to action. Now I know NGAUS does a great job with their newsletters, their monthly newsletters, their e-news blasts and things like that, and I do believe that every one of you should be reading it. But every single one of you has a story to tell, and every single one of you should be interfacing and speaking with your members of Congress and your state legislators. Because there's nothing more powerful than that communication between a member of the National Guard and your elected officials. In fact, I think the active duty, they're a little jealous of NGAUS and what NGAUS brings to the table. They're a little jealous of the fact that all of you are voting members of particular states. They're a little jealous of the relationships that many of you have with your members of Congress and your members of the legislature. So those of you who have those relationships, you need to keep it up. And those of you who don't have those relationships, just know that we know as members of Congress that every single one of you are our constituents. A little different from the active duty. I hear many of them are members of, voting members, constituents of Texas, but they may live in Hawaii, or they may live in California, or whatever, but it's not like that for the National Guard. Every single one of you serving in your states is a constituent of that congressional district in that state. So those are the two things that I wanted to mention up front, and then I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Representative Kelly.
Well, it's hard to follow these guys. First of all, I want to recognize our Adjutant General, Mississippi Major General Collins, who not only is our Adjutant General to me, but he was also my brigade commander when the 155 Brigade did full spectrum operations in Iraq in 2005. I also want to recognize Brigadier General Robinson, who is our director of the National Guard Association in Mississippi, and our ATAG, but he also was my battalion commander in that same rotation in 2005, and I was his battalion operations officer in the Engineer Battalion, or Task Force Night. I want to recognize Brigadier General Brewer and Major General Hill Air, and I almost forgot my raider, Brigadier General Kennedy from the Mississippi delegation, who are all here, so never forget your raider. I also would like to thank General Grass for meeting with us yesterday. We had a good meeting there. The Guard, I was here for General Hargett retired, and he said the Guard has been good to me in one of the presentations yesterday. And you know, when I look through my life, the Guard has been so good to me, and it's such a huge part of my life, and always has. I joined as a private in 1985, and I went to basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, or Fort Lost in the Woods Misery, as we called it then. It's much more enjoyable as a colonel than it is as a private, I can assure you that. But it's not just me, and it's just like everybody out here, regardless of which state. My father joined the Mississippi Army National Guard in 1959, and he retired at age 60 in 2001 as a first sergeant. My brother is a command sergeant major in one of the combined arms battalions in the state of Mississippi. So we know as a family what it's like to serve, and I know that most of the members out here, you as a family and your families all serve. And the other thing that I think we so often don't recognize, and I just want to make sure when I represent in Congress my state and you as the National Guard, we cannot forget our families who serve as greatly as we do. I know that every day that I've served, my wife of 25 years this December has served with me and raised my kids and done the things, and they do so much, or as much as we do as the soldiers who actually serve. So I'm really grateful to our families who allow us to serve in this great nation. People often say, you know, it's pretty neat to be a congressman, and it is, and I'm the newest guy there until next week, and I think we have a guy who's going to be junior to me. But the skills and leadership that I learned through the Guard have been so important to me. Most of the things that I have done in life have been because of the time and the people that I've met in the Mississippi Army National Guard. You have such role models and mentors. You get to learn how to lead by making mistakes and being on the front line. And it is so important that we tell those stories to all the people in our community and all the people on the Hill. And that's the one thing we have as the Guard, and like Representative Takai said, that they're jealous of sometimes, because of the entire Mississippi delegation, which is not as big today as it was yesterday, but still very, very big. They don't know Congressman Kelly, and most of them don't know Colonel Kelly. They know Trent. And they can pick up the phone, and most of those guys can text me at any time or call me and get me on the line. And it's not just the 04s and 05s and 06s and the general officers, but it's also those E5s that we know who know Trent. I still get calls about issues back at home from E5s that I served with 10 years ago who are retired. We need to make sure as National Guard members that we are exercising and letting our congressmen know from whatever district you are, whether it be a sergeant or the adjutant general of the state, it doesn't matter. If they have that relationship, please contact them and let them know how they can serve you and what's in your interest. And we need to do that a lot better. My military career, I understand deployments, and I understand the challenges that we are facing right now with sequestration, with the change in the force, reduction in force possibly. Because I went through this in 1990. I mobilized in 1990, and Major General Collins was then Captain Collins, and I was Second Lieutenant Kelly. And we fought this same fight in the 90s following Desert Storm coming back, and the budgetary constraints, the reduction of the forces, and trying to figure out what the right mix was. And so it's the same fight, and I've been through it before, and I think that prepares me to help represent you in Congress, because I have fought through this same battle before. I also deployed in 2005 and 9 and 10, and so I understand firsthand how those mobilizations and how we are an operational reserve now, which is much different than the strategic reserve that we were in 1990 when I mobilized. And the preparedness of our soldiers, I know firsthand as a leader of combat troops exactly how prepared our nation's National Guard is and will always be. We will never win a war without the citizen soldier. The final thing I want to do is I want to recognize the Ohio delegation, because I served 340, or about 340 of their soldiers served with me in 9 and 10 in Iraq, and I also the Kentucky delegation, who also had a company of in lieu of MPs that served with me. And the final thing, I'm going to brag just a little bit, because I can't help it, because I'm so proud to, my congressman growing up was the late G.V. Sonny Montgomery, also retired Major General. And I have a picture of him when I mobilized in 1990 with my brother, who was a specialist, and me as a second lieutenant, and my mother and my great aunt, and my dad was mobilized with us too, but he was already gone forward, so he was an E6 at the time. And I still keep that picture and look at it, and I remember what a difference he made for the National Guard in this nation. And the bragging part is he commanded the 150th Transportation Battalion in Meridian, Mississippi, as a battalion commander. And I was blessed many, many years later to be hung on the same battalion command wall when I commanded the 150th Engineer Battalion, which is the same lineage and honors as the late G.V. Sonny Montgomery. And we need more G.V. Sonny Montgomerys in Congress who will work across the aisle and shake hands and get things done and always take care of our veterans and our National Guards. And I think we will do the work in Congress. Just call your guy or girl and tell them to do the same. Thank you, and God bless you all.
So I step up here with my tail between my legs and have to recognize a huge error on my part. Although I listened to the Sergeant at Arms announce our great distinguished guest before us, I didn't pay attention when I read my notes in the book that were inaccurate. The gentleman to my immediate left is Representative Jim Bridenstine, not Steve Bridenstine, as I may have said. So I'm going to try to make up for it. So the first thing I did, although I was listening, I got on and I followed you on Twitter. and to try to further that, you know, I have my Buckeye Bob pin from the Ohio National Guard for you. And the least I can do, since you're so new to the Guard, if you haven't got this tradition going yet, let me coin you with the NGAUS coin.
Thank you.
Man, you can't make this stuff up. He just said I can call him anything I want, but I really think that I'll just call you sir at this point.
Until I put on my other uniform.
That's fair enough. Fair enough. So now is your opportunity to line up at the mics. This is your chance to ask members of Congress that question that's burning in your heart or burning in your chest or just on your lips. So it looks like we have someone there already. Please go ahead.
Hello, members of Congress. I'll just say we're all really proud of you guys. Colonel Robert Price, he used to do some legislative work at the National Guard Bureau and would meet with the NGAUS-led legislative conference periodically. And one of the things that would come up all the time was the value in inviting elected officials to our armories for drill and annual training for them to see what we do. And we talked quite a bit about the importance of commanders and staffs sort of getting behind that. Occasionally we would hear resistance and hesitation from commanders and staff to inviting especially members of U.S. Congress, senators and representatives. Those guys are too busy, they work at the strategic level and we're just a engineer company. We don't want to get crosswise with that, with what they're doing. So I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on the value of having commanders and staff invite senators and representatives to visit unit training and see it firsthand, so that because they wouldn't listen to me, maybe they'll listen to you.
I think that's a valid point, and it goes back to most of our congressmen and senators know people in your district, and they know these soldiers. Sometimes they don't know exactly what they do. I think it's a great opportunity, and please invite us. We have schedulers, so we can't always make those things, but when we can, we absolutely do. And the flip side of that is, anytime your soldiers are in the D.C. area and we're in session, please make sure they come by our offices and visit with us and bring their families by, because we need to see how they perform. Fortunately, I don't have to go to a Guard assembly to know what they're doing at Guard, because I have them every month, just like you guys, sometimes multiple times in a month. But I think it's very important that you contact your member of Congress and have them to come see what you're doing, especially when you're engaged in field exercises and we're doing our art of war and our craft that we learn and do so well.
I've got to agree. I mean, I was part of the employer support of the Guard and Reserve, ESGR, and for many years when there was money, we would do boss lists. We would bring bosses across the ocean to wherever our brigade was training. I think you can't beat that type of opportunity. And in fact, I would challenge the TAGs and the CACOs, the Congressional Action Contact Officers in every state, to put out a call and ask members of your Guard units who knows your members of Congress and your senators. You'd be surprised. We all have neighbors, we live in your communities, and I can guarantee you that in every state there's someone that knows the members of Congress extremely well. I've had fortunately the pleasure of being at NGAUS for the past 12 years. My first NGAUS conference was in Vegas in 2004, and I've come ever since. And I'm so glad to be here today to be amongst friends. But next year is a presidential year, and we're going to go to Baltimore. I'll tell you that one of the things that we did when we had NGAUS in Baltimore in 2006, I believe it was, the Hawaii delegation spent a couple of days after NGAUS. We rode a bus into town, visited every member of our delegation, and actually had an opportunity for those that never been to Washington, D.C. to tour the nation's capital. Those are the types of experiences that both benefit you as Guardsmen, but also benefits your congressional delegation. So there are many ways, I think, Robert, your question is well taken, and in fact, I think we should spend some time in your state delegations over the next few months strategizing and figuring out how you can best make contact with your members of Congress.
From my perspective, I was in the only reserve command and control squadron in the United States Navy, VAW 77. We did counter-drug operations, and we were involved in busting about $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas. And then my squadron got eliminated. One of the reasons I ran for Congress, as a matter of fact. And here was what was interesting to me when I got to Washington, D.C. I talked to various members of Congress, even from the very state from whence my squadron was from. And interestingly, nobody had any idea that this squadron was even eliminated. We were responsible for busting $2 billion worth of cocaine on the high seas every year. We were the strategic depth, the only strategic depth squadron for the Navy Reserves, and nobody had a clue in Washington, even on the Armed Services Committee, even in the state from where we were from, nobody had any idea, or how it happened, or why the decision was made. This is why it is absolutely critical that you talk to your members of Congress. Let them know what the assets are, what the impacts are for national security. So I can tell you, I haven't seen it from a National Guard perspective yet, but I have seen it from a Navy perspective. We are losing capability under the defense sequester, critically important capability. One of the first things that happened when I got to Washington, D.C. is it came to my attention that the only reserve command and control squadron in the Air Force Reserves was getting cut as well. This was the 513th Air Control Group out of Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. And of course, I had been on the receiving end on the Navy side, and since this was my state of Oklahoma, I wanted to make sure that people knew what was happening in Washington, D.C. as it related to the AWACS Reserve Squadron, the only strategic depth in the reserves for the AWACS. At the end of the day, we got it done in the National Defense Authorization Act that we preserved the 513th Air Control Group, as well as 7 AWACS aircraft that were scheduled to be cut. And now, that was in 2013. In 2014 and 2015, those cuts are not even on the table. Nobody's even talking about it. So engagement with your member of Congress is critically important, especially those of us that are on the committees of jurisdiction, where we can actually have an impact in the best interest of the defense of this nation.
Gentlemen, good morning. My name is Colonel Hank Harder from the great state of Vermont. I want to thank you for taking the time to come talk to our conference this morning. As you all may know, the members, of the men and women of the Guard have great appreciation for our drill status soldiers and airmen to be able to take part in TRICARE insurance program, just like our AGR soldiers and airmen. What you probably are aware of, or I hope you are, is that our full-time technicians are prohibited from taking part in TRICARE. For many soldiers and airmen that are in this job day in, day out, that comes to about $5,000 per year in gaining private insurance. Just want to hear your opinions. I realize we're in a budget-constrained environment, but would there be any traction in trying to open up TRICARE to our full-time technicians? Thank you.
So from my perspective, I think this was an oversight from members of Congress. The way the law reads, if you're eligible for the Federal Employee Retirement Plan, or the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan in this case, then you're not eligible for TRICARE. And that was made as a blanket kind of statement regarding the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan. And I think what we need to do is we need to reconsider that for the Guard and the Reserves. And what we need to do as Congress is we need to get a report on what the difference in cost would be between the two programs, and then ultimately make the argument that guess what, our Guardsmen are fighting combat just like our active folks, and they have every right to TRICARE as our active folks do.
I wanted to add something to that because for M-Day soldiers, the challenge for many years has been access to health care. And when TRICARE was established, there was a gap for our drill status soldiers. We filled that gap in the form of TRICARE Reserve Select. And I can tell you, I have numerous examples of how that particular program, despite the small fee that soldiers and airmen have to pay every month, despite that, how that program is benefiting our Guard. You know, we've heard many stories prior to deployment about soldiers not being medically ready, medically fit to deploy, and you know, we have a program that we started a few years ago to allow a six-month TRICARE coverage prior to deployment. But even before that, there was no coverage for our M-Day soldiers. So, you know, one of the priorities that we've had, especially this year as we look at compensation, the Compensation Commission and what they're talking about in terms of healthcare as one of the areas that they're looking at, is the preservation of our current medical benefits for our Guardsmen.
I really don't have anything to add. I do think it can gain traction, and I think as an organization, you need to have priorities of which legislation is most important to you. And you have to prioritize those, and you have to push those. I think it'll take some time, but I do think it will gain traction. And I will do all I can to make sure that we take care of all our soldiers, whether they're technicians, AGR, or M-Day soldiers like I am. So great question.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, good morning. Colonel Joe Hargett from Mississippi. Good morning, Trent. This question, you know, we heard General Milley yesterday talk about continuing to mobilize the Guard under 12304. This issue is directly related to our readiness and our accessibility. You know, in 2003, when we started mobilizing Guard soldiers, we were mobilizing under a Contingency Operations Plan, 12302. Well, now as we transition to some type of stabilization and predictability with our mobilizations, we're transitioning to the 12304, which is what General Milley quoted yesterday. As we continue to mobilize our Guardsmen and women, that 12302 authority does not provide certain benefits to our soldiers in the form of the 180-day early TRICARE access, and nor does it provide the early retirement reduced annuity benefit. One of the things that I think we need to challenge is we've worked this through the various committees and the chain of command and administrative processes through NGB. I know personally I have, and we can't seem to gain any traction. So as you heard the chief yesterday talk about the accessibility and continuing to utilize the Guard, I think we need to stay focused on the accessibility to make our soldiers readily accessible by making that TRICARE available to them. Because if you take, Private Joe Smith that is either just out of college or doesn't have a job, he can't afford any type of access, that directly relates to his ability to deploy if he needs to get dental work done or some type of medical condition taken care of. And I would like to just know this morning the panel's thoughts on, is that possible to add those benefits to the 12304 authority? And second order effect of that is to make sure that the whole audience here realizes the impacts as we go forward of accessibility and readiness, the impacts 12304 has on our formations. Thank you very much.
Joe also was one of my former brigade commanders. I was his deputy. We talked to General Grass, or I specifically asked that question yesterday in a separate meeting that we met for about an hour and a half or so with General Grass. I think it's something that we owe our soldiers. We definitely need to make sure that we are ready, and our personnel readiness is so key in how good we are as a Guard. And so I think it's something that definitely we as Congress will look at and make sure that we're mobilizing our soldiers so we get the greatest benefit for them, but also that we're taking care of them. They don't question us when we ask them to go for the most part, and we should make sure that we honor our commitment to them to give them all the benefits that they deserve.
On the right.
Okay. Cease Reed, retired from Wyoming. Thank you for leading the charge to the hill, so to speak. So keep attacking. I had the opportunity to have a good discussion with General Welsh, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, on different things, and we were talking about his frustration of Congress and, I don't know, the lack of the willingness to horse trade, and the gridlock that he's experienced, at least on the Air Force side, of getting things done. Would you like to comment on that, or how do we get back to the Byrds, the Lotts, the Montgomerys, to where we can get some things going and do that horse trade?
Well, it actually starts here. This, I understand, is the very first time we've had a congressional delegation, official congressional delegation to NGAUS. We've had a number of members of Congress and U.S. senators that have come mainly to receive awards and possibly give a keynote in their home states. But we are here as part of a congressional delegation, and we intend to do this every single year, and we intend to have this session every year, and we intend to have more people as we go forward. I don't think that Congress in Washington, D.C. is as bad as you see it on TV. I mentioned earlier that I'm a Democrat, Trent's a Republican, Jim's a Republican, but we're great friends. I don't think it's like the Montgomery time, the Senator Inouye, Senator Ted Stevens, Tip O'Neill. Those times, I think, have passed us by. And I think part of the challenge in Congress right now is that my family, for example, lives back home in Hawaii, and I travel home as much as possible. In the past, travel to Hawaii was very difficult. Many members of Congress years ago pretty much lived in Washington, D.C., so they had a lot of time on the weekends and in the evenings to sit together and break bread. We are working on those types of opportunities. In fact, Trent and I have talked over the past couple of days about doing something like that every month or every couple of months. It starts with members of Congress from different delegations, different parties coming together. I wouldn't necessarily call it horse trading, although maybe that's what we do in Congress, but it's working together, compromising, giving and taking here and there. That still happens. But unfortunately, we have some significant challenges in the budget, the appropriations process. We can go into that a little bit, but it's truthfully, it's beyond our control, and we're working hard to attempt to address this with 8 days left of the federal fiscal year. But the fact is that we get along. Many of us in our chamber, and I'm pretty sure it's the same on the Senate side. We get along and we work together. You don't see that again. You don't see that in the media so often. They love to show the differences. They focus on those, and you have these ideas that we just don't talk, and that's not true.
I would also add, again, you don't see the bipartisanship, but we're on the Armed Services Committee together, and what you'll see is that we pass, the National Defense Authorization Act out of the Armed Services Committee with very strong bipartisan support. I think we had only 2 votes against it, one from my side of the aisle, and I think one from your side of the aisle. But that's a committee of over 60 members, all agreeing that the national security of this country is far more important than our personal preference on this little item or that little item. Now, not only did we pass it, out of a committee, but it comes to the floor of the House of Representatives, and again, very wide bipartisan support for the National Defense Authorization Act. So, what I would say is that we are able to accomplish things that are critically important for this country. I would also say, look, I'm a Republican, but I am critical of my party when my party does things wrong. And sometimes my party doesn't like that. I ran against an incumbent Republican in a Republican primary. And the reason I did that is because he voted for the sequester, the Budget Control Act, which triggered ultimately the sequester on defense and eliminated my squadron. And it's not just a personal thing, this was my squadron. It's again, it's not just a personal thing, although in this case it kind of was. This is a matter of the national security apparatus of this country being systematically undermined and destroyed. And guess what, friends? Both parties did it. It's not Republicans, it's not Democrats. This is a responsibility of both parties. And ultimately, we've got to be critical of Congress when they do things like this.
I have 2 points, and I'll try to make them very, very quick. First, when I was at the Army War College and graduated in 2010, there was a 3-star general, and I wish I knew his name, but he told us as a class, he said, relationships move at the speed of trust. It's one of the most profound statements, and I say it all the time. That's why I want to know who I can give credit to, because it's not mine. I stole that from that 3-star general. But the same thing is in Congress, and there are a lot of relationships that you don't see that are behind. But it's not like it used to be, and I think some of that is, if you go to the 70s and the 80s, almost 70% of our House and Senate were occupied by veterans. And I think veterans understand how to do, as we say in Mississippi, the work of the Lord. We know how to get in there and dig in and to get results and to not worry about partisanship. There are less than 18% of our serving representatives and senators have served or ever served in any form of military service. Now, I do not think it is a prerequisite to have military service to be in Congress. I think there are great, great folks who serve in other ways. But I think that having more veterans, and specifically National Guard guys who serve in our nation's Congress, is very important, because we know how to have a professional and a personal relationship, and they don't have to match up. I'm going to end when everybody's clapping.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Colonel Angie Stoll, the Chief of Staff of the great state of Colorado. I also sit as a member on the Chief of Staff Advisory Council Executive Committee. And this week we met, and one of the big topics we spoke about was full-time manning for the Army National Guard. This week, the last couple days, and today, with General Milley, General Hodges, and yourselves, we've spoken about a lot of strategic and operational requirements, of which the Guard stands ready for America's call to conduct. But behind, as you know, behind all of your units, there's a full-time staff, and we cannot stand up and continue to support at our current rate and the future requirements if we're going to be subject to reduction in full-time manning. What is your awareness, and what actions are you taking or can you take to prohibit, to cull the reduction that we're facing? Just to make, in case you don't know, we're in our second of 5 years of full-time manning reductions, and in FY16, Guard Nation is expected to lose another 675 AGRs and 1,111 technicians. And I know just for Colorado, and I know I speak for all 54, any further reductions in full-time manning is going to begin to be devastating on our ability to respond.
It already is devastating. It's crushing our country and the ability of our nation to defend itself. Yes, it's true it's on the AGR side, but it's also true in the active component. From my perspective as a member of Congress, we have to look at the entirety of our ability to defend this country. And under the defense sequester as it currently stands, we are losing that ability. We are weakening ourselves as a country. So what we have to do is we have to unwind the sequester on defense. And we have passed a budget in the House of Representatives that plusses up the spending on the Department of Defense to match the President's budget request with Overseas Contingency Operations funding, OCO funding. Used to be Global War on Terrorism funding. We have plussed up that account $38 billion to help deal with some of these issues. We also did it in the National Defense Authorization Act, and we did it in the Defense Appropriation Bill, all of which passed with strong bipartisan support. This is what we need to do. We need to pass a defense appropriation bill that unwinds these terrible cuts that are damaging the defense of this country. We've done it in the House of Representatives. It's time for the Senate to pass these same bills.
I agree with Jim. I mean, you know, I mentioned earlier that I supported the NDAA as well as the Defense Appropriations Bill this year. Tremendous support from armed services. But the truth is, the sequester doesn't only affect defense. So I've been advocating since being in Congress that we need to take a look at the sequester, not only for the defense side, but also the non-defense side. You may not know that the Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, is not on the defense side of the sequester. It's on the non-defense side. So as we've been fighting this recent war for the past 13, 14 years, and the number of veterans have increased, you know, we hear every once in a while the challenges that the VA has, and we wonder why there's not enough funding for our veterans, and it's also because of the sequester. So we've got to unwind it. I agree 100% with Jim. But we also have to look at unwinding the sequester across all the departments of the federal government.
There's so many fights right now. I think number one, organizations like NGAUS going to bat for you is how you sustain and make sure that we get this right. The second part of that is, you know, and I keep going back to this, most of you folks out there know one of your congressmen or senators in your state personally. Don't assume we know what your ideas are, and don't assume that we know what your issues are, because we only know those when you tell us. And so I'm asking my Mississippi delegation, they continue to text, they continue to call, and let me know their ideas personally so that I have a buy-in on their issues and their problems. So I think the best way that you do that is the people who are affected, call your congressman and call your senator and weigh in and let them know how important that issue is to you. And that's the best thing that we're going to get things changed, and that's the way you make things bipartisan in nature, because I guarantee you we have folks in both parties and neither party out there. So call or text and make sure we know your issues.
You know, we had an opportunity to talk to General Grass, and also had an opportunity to talk to Mike and General Hargett, and I mentioned to them that, you know, we have a lot of needs in the National Guard. We have a lot of needs for NGAUS. There's a whole list of priorities, but we got to get down to business, and we got to focus on a certain few key areas. So I will mention just a couple, as we move forward over the next few months. We already talked about the sequester and the challenges that we have with the budget. We have to be able to tell that story, whether it's full-time manning or just strength across the entire Guard and how that's impacting our states. That's one. Number two, which is a big challenge that we have in front of us, is the Aviation Restructuring Initiative, ARI, that's right now on the books, and the plan is to move all the combat aviation assets from the Guard to the active component. That would be devastating for us here in the Guard for a number of reasons, but that story needs to be told by you. Members of Congress don't understand, if they're not in the Guard or they have friends that are close to the Guard, how important it is to stop that initiative. We in the Armed Services Committee, working again bipartisan, put an amendment to freeze the transfer of Apaches from the Guard to the active duty for 60 days after the commission comes out with its report. It's that important to us in Congress. But as we move forward and the decisions are made by the commission, it's going to be very important for all of you to talk to your members of Congress and talk about how important it is to preserve that asset. And I would just add that the number that we're using in terms of the cost savings and efficiency of the Guard is 30%. In other words, a combat aviation brigade, or any unit for that matter, is 30%, National Guard unit is 30% of the cost of an active duty unit. Keep that in mind when you talk to your members of Congress. So we save the federal government, we save our taxpayers 70% in the case of Guard units as compared to active duty forces.
Greg. Mike? Okay. Greg Schwab, retired Air Guard, Iowa. There's several measures of a nation's strength. Clearly, as National Guardsmen, we tend to focus on the military measure of strength. But economic power is another one. And while, sequester was an attempt to address the national debt and our economic power. So I would appreciate your thoughts on, okay, how do we balance this? We want military strength, we want economic strength. There are many citizens who are very concerned about, the national debt. How do we balance those two? What's your perspective?
Well, since I brought up eliminating sequester on defense and non-defense, I'll just start. I've said this, I think everybody is concerned about the national debt. Everybody's concerned about the annual deficit, but I believe that we're moving in the right direction. The annual deficit has decreased tremendously over the last few years, and we're heading in the right direction. I'm not saying that I support a huge debt. I'm not saying that I support continued annual deficits. What I'm saying is that this sequester is killing us, and we can get to where we need to get to over time, but we can't do it in 1 year, and that's the challenge.
So a couple of things. When you think about the budget of the United States, 2/3 of the budget of the United States is on autopilot: Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That represents 2/3 of federal spending. Members of Congress will not touch it. I understand the deficit has been cut in half, but if you look at the tables going forward, those programs grow at an exponential rate. And members of Congress won't touch it. One party wants to spend more on those programs. The other party would like to reform them, but is afraid because they'll make commercials of Paul Ryan throwing grandma off the cliff. So these programs are not touchable by politicians in Washington, D.C. It is a huge problem for this country. Then you've got 1/3 of federal spending. 1/3 of federal spending is what we call discretionary, not mandatory, we call it discretionary. That's the money that we have to authorize and appropriate every year on an annual basis. Now here's the thing, half of that 1/3 is defense. Now, we go through 12 appropriation bills in the House of Representatives in order to finance that 1/3 of federal spending, half of which is defense. So we do defense appropriations, homeland security appropriations, energy and water development appropriations, transportation, housing and urban development, financial services. We go down the list, right? We've done 8 of them this year. That's the way we, up here on this table, are able to represent you. Because we're able to go down to the floor of the House of Representatives in an open amendment process. The appropriation bills are an open amendment process. So I can go down, for example, when we were facing the AWACS cuts in Oklahoma, I could go down and say we need to cut spending in this area, we need to plus up spending in this area. Ultimately, we were able to do that. And that's a representative form of government. Now what happens is, we pass all these bills in the House representing our constituents in an open amendment process where I can at least go home and tell my constituents, look them in the face and say, look, I might not have won the vote, but I represented you, I made the best argument I could, and I couldn't get it done, but at least I got to represent you. So I voted yes on the appropriation bill because I got to represent you. Ultimately, what happens though, we pass these bills in the House of Representatives. I think so far this year we've passed 7 or 8 of them. They go to the Senate and they die. They just die. Harry Reid passes nothing. No offense to the Democrats. If you read your 8th grade textbook, we pass bills in the House, they pass bills in the Senate. They might not look like each other, but at least you can then appoint conferees, you can come to a negotiated settlement, and we can repass those bills. That's the way the process is supposed to work. For the last 6 years, we passed bills in the House, they passed nothing, and ultimately, here's where we are. In September, at the end of this month, we are facing a government shutdown, which affects people in this room. And here's what they do. In the last minute, on the last day, they're going to roll all 12 appropriation bills into one massive spending package. It's going to be called a CR. They're going to say, we're going to spend next year exactly as we spent last year, again, denying you your representation, but if you don't vote for it, the government shuts down. This is a broken process. And friends, the problem is Republicans and Democrats alike vote for it. It denies you your representation. It takes off the table the constitutional power of the purse that Congress is supposed to have, and ultimately it results in the continued problems that we're seeing. Now, I will attest to you, your question was about the economics of the United States. We're not going to solve the crisis that is looming. Remember, we have been having trillion-dollar deficits, again, both parties. It started under President Bush, it's continuing under President Obama, it's continuing. These challenges that we face need to be dealt with. For years, we were doing, probably you're familiar with quantitative easing. The Treasury has to sell bonds to finance the government because members of Congress aren't doing what they ought to do on the 2/3, the mandatory programs. So we're just selling all these bonds, but at 3% interest, when you got a looming government shutdown every year, and an $18 trillion debt, who wants to buy those bonds? Well, it's hard to sell them. So the Federal Reserve was creating money out of thin air. They're taking the newly created money, they're buying the newly created bonds, and voila, the government is funded. The challenge is we've created so much liquidity in this country. The question that you asked was about the economy. We've created so much liquidity. Now we've got $4 trillion in this country sitting on the sidelines. My concern is when that money comes into the markets, you'll see massive amounts of inflation. We have recreated for ourselves today the same economic situation that we had in the 1970s. Again, this is a problem of both parties. Now, ultimately, the economic crisis, once the inflation occurs, you got to quell the inflation. The Federal Reserve will sell those bonds. They'll get the dollars out of the market to try to quell the inflation, but now you've got a glut of bonds on the market. The price of bonds goes down, interest rates go up, high inflation, high interest rates at exactly the same time. There are people in this room that were alive in the 1970s. We have done that to ourselves again, because your members of Congress on both sides of the aisle will not do what is necessary for this country. So it is a concern. High inflation, high interest rates. Here's the challenge that we have today that we didn't have in the 1970s. Now we have an $18 trillion debt. 10% of what your government spends is service on that debt. The scenario I just described, imagine interest rates going from 3% to 6%. Now service on the debt is 20% of federal spending. If interest rates go to 9%, that's 30% of federal spending. If interest rates go back to the 1970s, 18%, now that's 60% of federal spending. We can't, we can't solve this crisis by eliminating the Department of Defense. We could eliminate the entire discretionary side of the ledger, and it doesn't solve the crisis. Friends, we have an issue that politicians on both sides of the aisle need to come to grips with. And that is, we've got to figure out how to responsibly balance this budget. And there's things we can do. Economic growth is a piece of it. But ultimately, we've got to come to grips with the reality that we're facing right now. And by the way, we've been there before. We can deal with this, but it's going to require bipartisan support to make it happen.
I just wanted to add something briefly. I think Jim did a great job, and I do agree with him, except for one point. I think the mention of Harry Reid was really last fiscal year, so I'll end at this. I think we're getting kicked off.
He's still filibustering all the bills.
Well, the last time I checked, the Republicans had leadership of both the House and the Senate, and you know, and this is serious. So we don't have a budget. You know, we talked about the defense appropriation bill that we passed months ago in the House, still sitting on the table. We have to work together in a bipartisan fashion, but the Democrats lost control of the Senate last year. And I do believe it's important for leadership of both the House and the Senate, in this case the Republicans, to come forward and put together spending bills, appropriation bills that we can vote on. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that. So we have, like I said, 8 more days, and unfortunately, well, hopefully we'll have a CR, but unfortunately we're going to have a CR, and we're going to do budgeting and appropriations like that for the next few months. One of these days, I agree with Jim, we've got to look at the regular order and regular appropriation bills going through Congress. And I do believe that it's going to happen because we're going to work together on it, right?
Yeah, and just so everybody knows, I love Mark Takai.
And on that note,
I love you too.
we love you all.